This week in Southeast Asia, sustainability looked less like a slogan and more like a hard operating question. Can the grid support the next wave of growth? Can companies access capital for transition projects? Can exporters prove their carbon story when buyers and regulators start asking sharper questions? That is the shift worth paying attention to. The useful way to read this week's news is not as separate headlines. Read them as business signals. The same pattern keeps appearing across the region. Growth is still happening, but it is running into physical limits, financing filters, and compliance expectations. This week, the pressure was around power, finance, infrastructure, and proof. The first signal came from Malaysia's data center debate. The headline was not simply that demand is growing. The more important point is that electricity and water planning are becoming part of industrial strategy. Digital growth is no longer only a question of land, incentives, and connectivity. It is also a question of whether the surrounding system can support the load. For Malaysia, data centers can bring investment, jobs, and digital infrastructure, but the sector also concentrates demand in specific places. If approved capacity turns into real usage too quickly, utilities, water operators, and regulators will need much tighter planning. The issue is not whether data centers are good or bad. The issue is whether growth is sequenced properly. For businesses, this is a warning that growth projects will face more questions about resource use. Power availability, water access, heat management, and credible efficiency plans may become part of whether a project gets approved, financed, or welcomed by local communities. The operator lesson is simple. Resource planning is becoming a license to grow issue. The second Malaysian signal was finance. Sustainable finance demand is moving further into the mainstream, which means banks and investors are looking for more than broad sustainability statements. This matters because sustainability does not scale only through awareness. It scales when companies can fund equipment, buildings, energy systems, logistics changes, and process upgrades. The practical issue is credibility. Companies that can show energy savings, waste reduction, lower carbon materials, better data, and real project pipelines will have stronger conversations with lenders. Companies that cannot show the numbers may find sustainability finance harder to access. In other words, the market is slowly separating intention from execution. This matters because transition does not happen only through policy. It happens when capital moves. If Malaysian businesses want to modernize factories, upgrade equipment, install solar, improve logistics, or reduce waste, the financing story has to be measurable. The best sustainability teams will increasingly work like project finance teams, with baselines, savings, payback periods, and implementation milestones. The third signal was regional. ASEAN's energy storage conversation is increasingly being framed as a competitiveness issue, not just a climate issue. That framing is important. When storage is discussed only as a renewable energy add-on, it sounds optional. When it is discussed as competitiveness infrastructure, it becomes central to industrial planning. Energy storage helps manage renewable power, but it also protects industry from volatility. For manufacturers, data centers, ports, industrial parks, and logistics hubs, the question is not only whether power is green. The question is whether power is reliable, affordable, and available when needed. A low-carbon grid that cannot support operations will not attract serious investment. This is where storage becomes business infrastructure. Batteries, grid management, distributed energy, demand response, and better forecasting are not side projects. They are part of how Southeast Asia competes for investment. The countries that can combine clean power with reliability will have an advantage in advanced manufacturing, data infrastructure, and export industries. Indonesia gave the fourth signal with the start of its B50 biodiesel mandate from July 2026. This is a major energy security move, using a higher palm-based biodiesel blend to reduce dependence on imported fossil fuels. For a large economy with transport, agriculture, and industrial demand, fuel policy is not a small technical adjustment. It affects costs, supply chains, and domestic commodity strategy. For Indonesia, the policy supports domestic palm oil demand and fuel security. But it also raises practical questions around feedstock supply, pricing, logistics, engine compatibility, and long-term sustainability standards. If traceability improves, biofuels can become a strategic advantage. If it does not, they can become a reputational risk, especially with global buyers watching land use and supply chain credibility. The Philippines gave another infrastructure signal. The San Miguel Bay offshore wind project moved further toward auction discussions, showing that Southeast Asia's offshore wind pipeline is no longer theoretical. But offshore wind is a good reminder that clean energy ambition only becomes real when the market design is bankable. For businesses, this matters because major clean energy projects create supply chains, fabrication, logistics, engineering, environmental services, construction, monitoring, and maintenance all become opportunities if the market is structured well. Ports need to be ready, grid connections need to be ready, contractors need skills, finance needs confidence. That is where the commercial opportunity sits. Indonesia also highlighted last mile electrification through renewable mini grids and solar home systems with batteries. Remote and island communities cannot always wait for central grid expansion, so mini grids can become one of the most practical parts of the energy transition. The real test is not the installation photo. The real test is whether the system still works years later. Vietnam's steel sector added the compliance signal. Exporters are facing a future where carbon performance can affect market access and cost, especially when selling into markets with stricter, climate-linked trade rules. This is where sustainability becomes very commercial. It can affect pricing, buyer preference, documentation requirements, and competitiveness. For steel, cement, aluminum, furniture, construction materials, and other manufacturing sectors, this is the direction of travel. Buyers will increasingly ask for product data, energy data, materials data, and emissions data. The companies that prepare early will have cleaner conversations with customers. The companies that wait may discover that compliance is more expensive under pressure. So, what is the operator view for the week? Southeast Asia's sustainability transition is becoming more practical, but also more demanding. The winners will not be the companies with the best slogans. They will be the companies that measure better, finance better, and execute better. Start with the constraints that affect growth: power, water, materials, waste, finance, and market access. Then ask a very practical question. Which of these constraints could slow down your next project, your next customer, or your next financing discussion? That is where the opportunity is. Sustainability is no longer just about looking responsible. In Southeast Asia, it is becoming part of how businesses get approved, funded, supplied, and trusted. The companies that treat this early as an operating advantage will have more room to move than companies that wait for pressure to arrive. If this weekly briefing was useful, subscribe to the Green Factor. And in the comments, tell us which story has the biggest business impact for your sector this week.